All right, everybody, good afternoon. My name is Annette Roth, and we're going to begin our webinar. Today, we have with us Corinne Mayer, who is an ASL interpreter. So for those of you that need support in that realm, we have her here to do that. You should be able to see her pinned at the top of your screen, or either right above me or right below me. So thank you all for joining us. I'm Annette Roth. I'm the Community Development Manager here at the Washington State Arts Commission, and we are here in the second of a three-part series about building for the arts. It's a webinar series that we are hosting on behalf of our friends at the Department of Commerce, who I believe some folks are here with us today. So if we have questions that are specific for them, we might turn it over to them. For those of you that joined us or weren't able to join us last time, in the first episode of this series, we provided folks with an overview of Building for the Arts and how it works. In this particular webinar, we're going to talk about how to build a solid project and plan and what you should be thinking about as you develop your project and how to manage it successfully. Adrienne Kerrigan is with me today. She is our person on tech and running the PowerPoint. She will also be monitoring the chat for those of us who are here. So really quickly, we'd love to have folks in the chat introduce themselves. Just tell us where you're from, your name really quickly, and where you're from. And we are going to hold questions to the end. So if you have questions throughout the day after we get into the chat or after we get through the introductions, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can at the end of the day. All right, so I see some folks who are joining or who are introducing themselves. Thank you so much for that. All right, so Adrienne, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, so I want to just start with an extremely brief overview of the Building for the Arts program. And, before we get into the topic of building your project, for those of you that missed the first webinar. Building for the Arts is a Washington State Department of Commerce program administered by their Community Capital Facilities team. This is a competitive grant program, and it awards state funds to nonprofit, community-based organizations to defray up to 33% of eligible capital costs for the acquisition and major new construction or renovation of arts and cultural facilities. The grant is specifically for arts-related facilities, such as arts museums, cultural facilities, theaters, performing arts centers, tribal centers such as longhouses, exhibition halls and spaces, broadcast and recording studios, et cetera, that sort of thing. Historical museums are ineligible for this grant and should instead contact the Washington State Historical Society to see what kind of grants they have for historical museums. Now, our role at the Washington State Arts Commission is to work in partnership with Commerce to do outreach and informational consultations about the program. We, as the State Arts Commission, have a strong connection to arts and culture organizations across the state, particularly in rural communities. And so our role here is to make sure that as many people as possible get to be able to learn information about the program and potentially apply for it either now or in the future. The purpose of this is to ensure equity across the state for those rural and underserved communities. And it's a great partnership. We've been working with Commerce in this role for the past few years. And it's been really beneficial, I think, for the program and getting folks in other places across the state to participate in the program. Next slide, please, Adrienne. So this grant program is available to tribes and nonprofits registered in Washington State. Additionally, there are several other qualifications for eligibility, including binding control of the project site, having a legally constituted board of directors for the organization, LEED certification, either applying for LEED certification or applying to not do LEED certification for the project, which we'll talk about that in a second. Agreeing to pay for state prevailing wage for the project, having made some substantial progress in a capital campaign or securing funding outside of the grant for this project. And we're going to go in depth about many of these things as we go throughout the webinar. Next slide, please. So in the current law, the cap for available funds for the Building for the Arts program is $18 million total for all grantees within a biennium. Maximum grant awards for the current funding round are $2 million, and there is no minimum grant amount. The grant does have a required match. So this means that in order to receive funding, you must have your own organizational funds to bring to the table. The grant can provide up to 33% of eligible project funds. And this is a reimbursable grant, meaning that Commerce will reimburse you and your project for eligible costs after they have been incurred and submitted to Commerce. There can be no advancement of payment under any circumstances for this project, for this program. So now all of these grants, the Building for the Arts grants, are intended to fund bricks and mortar. So there are some costs that cannot be associated with the projects and some that can be reimbursed. We discussed what they were in depth in the first webinar, but really quickly, broadly thinking about things like design and engineering, architecture, construction costs, initial furnishings, landscape, and real property when combined with a building project are eligible costs that can be reimbursed. Things that cannot be reimbursed or that would be considered to be ineligible include administration, fundraising, feasibility studies, lease or mortgage payments, moving of equipment, and non-capital expenses such as a website, for example. So please note that only arts and culture related aspects of a project can be funded. Okay. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about some organizational and environmental conditions for success. So how do you know that you are going to be successful managing, developing, and executing this project? One of the things to think about is this project realistic and able to come to fruition? Does your organization have what it takes to make the project happen? And that means, do you have a strong organizational structure? Do you have a solid group of folks helping to lead the way? Do you have strong board commitment to ensure that they are willing to see this project through? Is your organization solid and feasible for the long term? Meaning, do you have the capacity to manage the facility and ensure its long-term viability? Now, remember, one of the things about this grant program is that it's intended to fund these projects, and there's a minimum amount of time that they need to be, viable projects, and that is about 15 years, right? So, and if you have any of those things that are missing, what are the gaps that need to be filled within your organization? And so, some of these things are things that you would want to think about in the very early stages of your planning, right? Or even in pre-planning, making sure that your organization is solid and you have a good plan for success over the long term. These projects can take years and years to get through, years of capital campaigning. Construction can take several years. You might have to do a large construction project in multiple phases. And so are you going to be able to make it through that over the long term? That's something that you will need to do to be able to make sure that you have for your organization. But that's also one of the things that that the Department of Commerce will be looking at as you submit your application. And something to think about is, would you be able to move this project forward if you never got funding from Building for the Arts, right? So are you able to make that happen? You also want to think about what the market needs and assessment are for this project. Is there community interest in your project? Do you have data to back that up and not just a build it and hope they will come situation, right? That rarely pans out. But we need to be able to see market information about the efficacy of your project, of your organization. How many, if you're a theater, for example, how many folks do you draw to your community theater, and what does that look like for you over the long term? Do you have future potential markets that you could tap into? as you go through, thinking about that long-term planning for the success of this project. And, are there other folks in your region who are doing the work where you are, right? If you're the only theater in a really rural community, that is a pretty strong and significant need. And that's really important to make sure that you can keep that available to the community, right? And so what would happen if your organization didn't provide the services that you provide? How would that be a detriment to the community? How would that be a detriment to to the folks that you serve? So when you're thinking about how are we going to be successful, you need to focus on all of those kinds of things with your organization and with the potential market that you're trying to reach. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about feasibility studies. So the definition, so a feasibility study or feasibility project assesses how practical your capital project is. The study itself is designed to tell you what resources are required to complete your project and what its likelihood of success are. Now, please note that not all projects that are eligible for Building for the Arts need a feasibility study. So some examples of projects that might not need a feasibility study would be something like a really straightforward project for replacing the roof and siding and windows, for example, of your building. Some smaller rural projects, depending on what they are, may not also need a feasibility study. But if you are doing a large scale addition to an existing building or you're building something from the ground up, you are going to need to get a feasibility study done for the project. And that would be part of your application submission as well. And so, the study is going to look at the project to make sure that it's realistic. It's going to look at a number of factors. So what are the goals and the vision of the project? Can it be realistic and come to fruition? Does the organization, again, organizational readiness, does your organization have what it takes to make this project happen? It's going to take a look at the market assessment and the needs assessment. I mean, what is the scope of work? How big is this project? What does the project funding look like? What is a reasonable timeline? And are you able to, with the organizational structure that you have, are you able to get the funding that you need in a timely fashion to be able to make this project happen, right? Now, one thing to note is you cannot use Building for the Arts funds to pay for feasibility studies, which we mentioned just a moment ago. The capital construction funds are reserved for construction activities only. So if you're thinking about, you're in phase one or the pre-planning phase of your project, which depending on what you're submitting your application for could be eligible for funding, things like architecture and construction or pre-construction costs like that, engineering could be considered expenses that you could submit for in your application, but you cannot do that for a feasibility study, right? Because they need to be able to see if this project is going to pencil and it's going to be realistic before they get into it. Okay. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about financing your project, you want to think about this. There's a note about the Building for the Arts program, is that the program only reimburses eligible project cost, and the rest of the funding must come from non-state sources, right? They can only do up to a third of those eligible costs. And so you have to be able to access, and have access to funds for the rest of the project. Non-state sources could include things like cash on hand, documented pledges, value of the land for the project, in-kind contributions that are documented. There's some restrictions around what those are going to look like for this coming year. You can also show a binding loan commitment as well. You're going to need to determine a reasonable budget through all of this. What is it all going to cost, right? So construction costs are going up significantly, and they certainly have over the past 4 or 5 years. We've seen construction, costs rise. And so, do you have a plan in place for what that looks like? Are you making projections to accommodate that? And if so, what does that look like? And how is that going to change your budget over time and your ability to secure the funding that you need? When you're thinking about that, you're also needing to think about your capital fundraising campaign if you need to do something like that, right? So have you made substantial progress in a capital fundraising campaign, right? A substantial progress, it doesn't mean 85% or 100%, but a pretty significant amount, depending on the size of the project. It could be for smaller projects or for more underserved communities, 15 to 20%. To be able to start with and also demonstrate over time that you have a plan in place for how you're going to get the money that you need to be able to cover the costs for the project as you get the funding. Some other things that you'll need to think about while you're thinking about your financing are LEED certification, which we'll talk about LEED certification here in a few minutes, and prevailing wage requirements as you access Building for the Arts. So adhering to these standards may increase the cost of your projects beyond what you might get if you're just getting a local, if you're just thinking about hiring a local person and not paying them prevailing wage. It's a requirement through the capital projects to pay those prevailing wages. And so those are all things that are going to be important. It's not a good idea to just guesstimate. You really want to do your homework and get some really strong estimates and quotes from the construction companies, from all of the folks that you're working with throughout this process to ensure that you'll have a realistic budget. Because if obviously if your construction costs come up and you have a budget shortfall, you're going to have to figure out a way to get that additional funds for the project. Okay. And so if you're looking at that, how are you going to make that happen? How are you going to secure funding? You could do a capital campaign. You could get grants from, other arenas, from nonprofit organizations or, from your local jurisdiction, potentially. Public funding, again, like from the city, if you're located within a city. Private donations are a good opportunity or a good way to secure funding, having cash on hand. And also if you are looking at getting grants from other sources, how are you going to raise the grant funds if you have a match for those grants from those other funding sources? Those are some things to think about as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit here about is a capital campaign. Now, for those of you who joined us, I believe it was last year, we did a series of webinars that we have on our YouTube channel. We can send out links to those as well, where we talked pretty significantly about a capital campaign. And I do want to talk a little bit more about that because that is a way that a lot of folks get additional funding for their projects, right? And so a capital campaign is a targeted fundraising effort that takes place over a defined period of time for a specific thing, right? It's not something that you do long term over years and years for a lot of different things. You would probably do a capital campaign for 3 primary reasons. One is for the construction or expansion of buildings, right? 2 might be for acquisition of land. If you were looking to purchase a piece of property to site your facility on it. And then another reason to do a capital campaign would be if you were going to do large scale equipment or supplies, such as say replacing your sound or PA system if you were performing arts hall, for example. Now, a capital campaign is something that will take, like I said, it's a defined period of time. So in the last example, let's say, for example, you were going to replace your sound system and you needed to figure out obviously how much it's going to cost. And then you would want to try to get the funding for that in a defined period of time, 9 months, a year. Your organization would be able to figure out what it's realistic for you to be able to manage, right? Now, capital campaigns do require a lot of planning and consideration. And so we have sort of four broad phases of a campaign. And, something that you'll have to think about is, can you manage all of this, right? So you have to do the planning part of it. Planning for anything takes a long time, right? A lot of times, especially for very large capital projects, you might have a consultant to help you come up with a capital campaign plan and look at the feasibility of your project. Then you're going to go into doing researching who could be some major donors and start to court them. That's going to be during the quiet period of your campaign. Oftentimes, those things happen behind the scenes and well before you do a public campaign for kicking off your project, right? And doing a large scale campaign and soliciting donations from the general public. Oftentimes your kickoff, depending on what you're looking for, may coincide with, some groundbreaking for this campaign. And then once you kick it off, you're going to want to take that public. You'll be doing events, potentially marketing, depending on the size and the scope of your project. This could become very expensive to do a capital campaign, especially when you're doing marketing, especially when you're trying to court, donors and all of that kind of stuff. And so making sure that you not only kind of figure out how much money it's going to cost for your construction project, but also those ancillary costs that come along with having this. You might have to have staff to manage a capital campaign or hire a consultant, a development person to do that for you. And that costs money, right? And paying for folks to be able to do that. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration before you jump off into a capital campaign. And so depending on the size of your project, you may be able to get by with not doing a capital campaign in your project. You might be able to cash flow, or if you have other ways to get funding for smaller projects, you could consider doing that as well and reserving capital campaigns for much, much larger projects, right? Especially if you're going to be doing a series of them over time. You might consider combining them all into one capital campaign. There can be some risk in trying to do multiple capital campaigns over the course of a few years. You would run into donor fatigue, for example. So those are some things to think about as you plan a capital campaign if you need one. Next slide, please. So when you're determining your project timeline, you want to start with the end in mind. When do you want your project to be done, or when do you want to be breaking ground on the project? If you've done your due diligence in the planning phase, you will probably have a good idea about this already. But your ability to secure funds for the project is going to have a huge influence on when you can actually start the project or when it's going to be completed. And so, when you're thinking about your project timeline, there are oftentimes multiple project phases. Broadly, they fall into three categories, which is sort of pre-project planning and maybe acquisition of your land or your building, the design phase when you're developing what this is going to look like, and then your construction phase, right? And so your capital campaign could be happening during all of this if you're doing a capital campaign, or could be happening in one specific section, like in the design phase, for example. But there will, oftentimes there can be multiple subphases within each of these categories as well. You can apply for Building for the Arts grants when you are in any or all of these phases, depending, but where you are in the timeline is going to depend on what kinds of costs you might be eligible to apply for. So you want to make sure that you are referring back to that eligible cost list to see what kinds of things you could submit reimbursements for if you were to get a grant in any given phase, right? And so eligible organizations can apply for different projects in the same program, but they can't apply to more than one of Commerce's grant programs for the same project, right? And then, but you could, if you wanted to, apply for multiple grants for Building for the Arts, but your applications must be for discrete parts of your project. So, for example, if you had one phase of your project was doing the getting a new roof and doing the siding and the windows and doors and that sort of thing for your building. That could be one project. And then you could reapply to Building for the Arts for another one if you're doing internal construction, for example, but you wouldn't be able to have crossover. So you couldn't apply in your second grant for more, for more pieces of the phase one project, for example. That's not allowable. And then when you're looking at your project phases, you have to think about what is realistic as you go through this, and how are you going to utilize your project phases to access Building for the Arts funding, but also other funding that might exist as well. And so, we always say add extra time to your timeline because you're definitely going to need it. There's always going to be something that will slow you down. Could it be permits? Could be weather? Could be supply chain issues. It's important to recognize that this is part of the planning process and this is part of the construction process. There could be delays and you have to be willing to manage through that. Next slide, please. So let's talk about LEED certification or exemption. So LEED stands for the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's certified by the US Green Building Council. Essentially, it is a high performance energy efficiency standard for construction. There's legislation in Washington state around capital projects or construction projects employing LEED. So the goal of the legislation is that major capital projects be built to LEED Silver standard where practicable. Okay. And you can get the most amount of savings and get the most amount of energy efficiency, which will ultimately lower your costs, operating costs over the long term, when you incorporate this notion of LEED early on in the design process. So you're going to want to start your project kind of from the beginning, thinking about if you are going to be required to meet this LEED Silver standard, or if you can take an exemption. So there are exemptions that do exist for this program. Again, we said, the standard or the goal of the legislation is that the projects be built to these environmental standards when practicable, right? And they recognize that that's not always practicable or realistic. So some of the exemptions that exist are for new construction of 5,000 square feet or less of conditioned space, or renovation projects that cost less than 50% of a facility's assessed value or are under 5,000 square feet, again, conditioned space. There could be other special cases as well. If you have some concerns or questions about that, or if your project could fit that criteria, or if it needs to be exempted, or if it doesn't need to be exempted, it would be a good idea for you to contact the Department of Commerce folks directly about what those kinds of questions could be. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is kind of a basic overview of what you want to start thinking about as you're building your project. The goal and the idea for you would be to, do your due diligence and plan all of those things out in advance before you start your application, or before you start getting into the application process. Oftentimes, these projects are going to take a couple of years, or as you go through your project planning, you might realize that some of your project splits in between when you can get funding for through Building for the Arts, potentially, right? Because that is on a biennial cycle. And so you might start your project halfway through a biennium and not necessarily be able to access funding immediately for that. So what does that look like for you, right? Those are things that you definitely want to plan and cash flow your project so that you can get through phases while you're also waiting to get additional funding. So we have some upcoming important dates that are coming up here pretty soon. So this is really essentially the grant application timeline. The grant opens on May 1st. So that's about 6 weeks from now. And the applications will be due at some point later in the summer. So the application window will be open for a couple of months. Applications will come in and get pre-screened for eligibility, and the ones that are considered to be, feasible and eligible for potential funding would go to an advisory board that will review them and will make recommendations to the Department of Commerce for funding, the Department of Commerce will then submit those recommendations into their budget, which will go before the governor's desk, and the governor's capital budget will be released in December of this year. And then there will be signing of the capital budget. So once it goes to the governor for signature for his budget, then the budgets have to go before both houses of the legislature. They kind of, take a look at what they need and what their priorities are, and they come up with a budget that is that they all agree upon, and that they're all going to agree to. It gets signed into law, essentially, at the end of the fiscal year, the beginning of June, for the next biennium, and then those funds will be released to Commerce in September of 2025 for submission to folks for the grants. In that period of time, if an organization is chosen to get funded for this program, they would work with Commerce to develop their grant contract and that sort of thing. And so any questions that you would have specifically about grant contracts would go to Commerce directly during that sort of planning and application phase. Next slide, please. All right, so we have some important dates that are related to planning and for the Building for the Arts application. So next week at the same time, we are going to be hosting a webinar here to talk about building a strong application. So what are some of the things you should focus on as you're planning your application? What are some things that will be important for you to remember as you do that, and that you can demonstrate in that application? So again, next Monday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll host that. Again, like I mentioned before, the grant application opens on May 1. And then the Department of Commerce will be hosting a number of online workshops or online and in-person workshops coming up, mostly in the second half of May. So there is going to be an online workshop that is open to whoever on May 16th at 1 o'clock. And then they're going to be hosting 3 in-person workshops in Seattle, Spokane, and Yakima, that basically the last week or so of May. So the one in Seattle is on May 21, the one in Spokane's on May 22nd, and then the one in Yakima is on May 28th. Commerce will be releasing information about, in registration for those workshops here relatively soon. And when that happens, we will work with them to make sure that folks get this information out, because we definitely want people to go to their workshops, especially if you can get to an in-person workshop, you'll have an opportunity to speak to folks directly and ask specific questions about your project. So we definitely want to encourage folks to do that as well. Next slide, please. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you. We have a few minutes here, then we'll take some questions. Contact information for me and also for Sarah Alway, who is the program manager for this particular grant at the Department of Commerce, is there. So, the idea is, we try to do some sort of initial consultations with folks and answer some questions that we can. But, we always turn it over to the folks at Commerce for more technical questions, especially as it relates to the application itself. So you can reach out to either me or to Sarah or someone at the CAP programs over there at Commerce for any questions. Right now, we'll go ahead and take some questions. So Adrian, are there questions in the chat, or if there are any folks that have their hands up, I can't really tell. We'd love to be able to do that.
Yes, so Rosanna Sharp has her hand up.
Okay.
Thank you. I have a question. You said that if you're a history museum, there's another place to apply. What if you're a zoo, an aquarium, a science-based museum? Is there another funding category place that funds those types of buildings?
That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if there's any folks from Commerce on the line who might have additional information about that. And if we, do we have any folks at all? If there's anyone from Commerce, you can just jump in. I can't really tell. I can't really see folks on the screen. So
I ask because the REACH is a PFD, it's a public facilities district. And we do have a nonprofit arm that supports the museum's work, but we are not a 501c3. So I'm wondering if PFDs can apply for Building for the Arts.
Hey, can I jump in here? Sorry, I raised my hand.
Hi, Michael, welcome.
Hey, yeah, I'm Mike Kendall. I'm with the Department of Commerce. Thanks for your question. Now, by statute, the grantee has to be the nonprofit, and the nonprofit has to control the project site and the what's going on inside of the programming. But you don't have to be a 501c3. You just have to be registered with the state of Washington as a nonprofit. But at the end of the day, the nonprofit has to have control.
I think Rosanna was asking about like science museum type things. Are there any grant programs that are available for them if they're not eligible through Building for the Arts?
Let's talk, give me a holler and let's talk about exactly what your programming is. You know, I won't automatically say no right off the bat without knowing a little more about it.
Okay, thank you.
And
Awesome.
hi, Rosanna. I think we met before.
Yeah, I'm on the board for BFA, but
Duh.
I'm sitting in a different seat this time. Thank you.
Well, I will definitely take your phone calls.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. I'm glad to see that you're here. And your hand is still raised too, by the way, I think.
Well, I better get rid of that.
Okay. All right. Adrian, do we have any other folks that have questions in the chat,
Yes.
or anybody who has a hand raised?
It looks like we've got another hand raised, and then we have some questions in the chat. So let's go with the hand raised first, which is Robin. Go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm with Lake World Gardens and grant writing, where we're rehabbing and restoring the historic carriage house on the property. My question though is regarding the feasibility study. We're in a couple years into the project, so we've done quite a bit of pre-planning, and we have the historic structures report, which lists out all the things that we need to do and all that stuffy stuff and good budgets. When you say feasibility study, is that a feasibility study in this, or is feasibility study only about fundraising?
No, I think that, I mean, obviously, depending on how in depth that it is, that could be considered. I mean, it's to take a look at the project itself, and not, I mean, obviously there's a fundraising component oftentimes within a feasibility study, but if you have information that talks about your project, that should be good. I mean, I would say if you want the folks over at Commerce to look specifically at your feasibility study to make sure that it fits within the parameters of what you would need, that I would definitely encourage you to do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Okay, Annette, let's see. We have a question from Sarah. Is a feasibility study required for a renovation of an existing building?
Depends on the size and scope of the project, again, there's some projects that are pretty straightforward, like the example that I mentioned. And so, they might not need that, but I would say definitely, again, talk to the folks at Commerce about what that could look like. And they would be able to tell you more specifically. Well, I mean, I guess the question is, what does that renovation look like specifically? Is it just like, oh, we're getting, siding and a roof and windows, or is it something much more extensive than that? And the size and the scope of your project as well. If it's a huge 1 million square foot building, that looks very different than a smaller theater, for example.
Annette, can I jump in again?
Fort Michael, thanks.
Just to be clear, feasibility studies are not a requirement, right?
Right, exactly. They're not. Yeah, that's what we're saying. So they're asking about, for the types of projects that you might want to see a feasibility study for, what does that look like?
Yeah, they're for larger projects, especially, that they can really be handy in determining, whether you should go forward, or that sometimes there are feasibility studies that are focused strictly upon fundraising. So you could have a fundraising feasibility study. So yeah, it's not a requirement at all, but for something that's pretty complicated, it can come in handy.
Good, thanks. Okay.
Okay, our next question comes from Martin. As to the assessed value of the property, is that pre-project or post-project? We have a project that is adding value to the property.
Are you in the process? I mean, are you in the process of doing it right now, or the project itself? Is it being constructed? Have you started it? I guess that's a question. That's something
We-
we probably want to know.
Sure. We're in the middle of the project. Actually, probably just past the middle now. Renovating a facility from retail purposes to public assembly. So we went from like a capacity of 50 people max to a capacity over 100, 120. And so it's changing the value of the property in the process. And I was just wondering if, the 50% valuation or assessment, 50% of the assessment is that taken when the project starts, or based on what the value is estimated to be after the project?
I think I
Great
can help
question.
with that one.
Go for it.
So it has to be within 6 months. Your evaluation needs to be within 6 months of the due date of the grant. So then that could be what the county assessment, or you could hire a professional to do that. But as long as it's done within 6 months of the application, we'll take whatever that is.
Unfortunately, this
Okay.
year, right?
Pardon?
So if they were applying this year, it would be essentially during this year.
Yes.
So 6 months inside this calendar year.
6 months from the date the application is due.
Okay. And that's in the dates that were about 3 slides back, right?
It's-
Great, thank you.
Our next question comes from Aaron. How far back can we incur expenses for reimbursement?
Oh, that's a great question. So you can usually go back one fiscal biennium, roughly. They'll have specific dates about what that looks like when they publish the guidelines, but I'm guessing, if I'm doing my math, it's 2023, Michael, 2022
Pretty
for
close.
this upcoming funding cycle.
Close. It's 3 years back from the beginning of the appropriation. So the upcoming biennium in which we're taking these applications for is the 25-27 biennia, which is just crazy to even think about. And that begins July 1 of 2025. So in that case, you can go back to July 1 of 2022.
Great. Excellent.
Okay, our next question is from Greg. Would passive house standard be an acceptable green standard in lieu of LEED?
That's definitely a Michael question.
No worries. The law is very specific, as it has to be LEED. I mean, I have heard some rumblings that LEED can it's complicated and it does cost money, and there's always talk about making it something more general. But as of now, that it has to go LEED.
And then our next question is from Iren. I hope I said your name all right. Is there a comprehensive itemized list of IT infrastructure items that are eligible for reimbursement?
I could do that one too. It's pretty simple, because there are probably thousands of things that would be eligible. It's all about, since we're funded with bonds, it has to last 13 years, right? So if the component you're looking at is in a wall, generally it can. And if it's not, if the manufacturer will say it would last 13 years, we'll take that as good. Obviously, the squishy here is computers, right? If you think about the computer you were using 13 years ago, it's probably not holding up too good. But there are, especially in arts projects, very complicated computerized sound systems and lighting systems, and we'll take a look at that. I mean, that's definitely borderline. And if they will say they'll last 13 years, then yeah, bring them on.
It's a great question. I think that's important for folks to know, because technology is changing all the time. Okay, Adrian, do we have any more questions? We have, I think, 30 seconds, so we have time for maybe one more.
We have one more. It's from
Okay.
Marnie. How often do folks consider a group of nonprofits for this funding? With the costs in Seattle, I'm very curious about working with several nonprofits on long-term solutions to facilities.
Maybe, is there a way that that person can kind of explain a little bit more about what they're thinking? If you could come off screen again, if
Sure.
not, then, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Marnie. Yeah, so we're a small nonprofit and we have very specific needs for specific times of the year. And I could imagine a world where other nonprofits have similar things that we could partner on a, like we don't want to rent a huge venue or buy or purchase or build for year round for just us. It doesn't make any sense. And rather than us taking that on and then also being a rental partner, it might be better to have other nonprofits as like a collaborative working on this, on facilities.
Interesting.
I think I could speak to that.
Okay.
So essentially, the grantee has to, again, both own the project and operate the project. If you, I'm thinking of, I'm trying to think of an example that I would use. Perhaps it's, I've seen, well, that's not going to work because that's rolling stock. The bottom line is if you're a seasonal, let's say you're a seasonal theatrical group, and your season is month X to Y, and then you've got another theatrical group or some other performing group that wants to take up that space in the times when you're not there. In that case, I think they would definitely look at it. But what you would need to, the way you need to set up is the grantee would have to own the facility and then lease to the other partner. There could not be more than one applicant. There can only be one applicant. But if you are considering that at the time of application, you'd have to have a memorandum of understanding or a joint operating agreement that spells out exactly which party is doing what.
Okay, and have you had that go on before? Like how often does it come up for these grants?
I've never seen it before, but that doesn't, it can't happen.
Okay, thank you.
Those were some fantastic questions, folks. If you have any other questions, you can put them in the chat really quickly right now before we close up shop, because we'll be able to download them and keep them. We are, compiling an FAQ of questions for folks, and then also obviously the folks at Commerce will have additional information as well. We are recording and captioning this webinar in addition to the other ones that we're going to be doing, and we'll be publishing those out. So if you want to rewatch it, or if you have folks on your team that maybe couldn't join, we'll be able to do that. We're going to publish them on our YouTube channel, but we'll send out links for those here relatively soon. This one we have to do some editing because we were talking before the show and that got recorded. So we need to make sure that that's not part of it. So look for those from us here pretty soon. And then we hope to see all of you next week on March 25th at 1:00 p.m. for the final of the series. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.